Noam Chomsky. We'll be talking to him in a moment, but first, a little about him.
I'm Noam Chomsky. I'm on the faculty at MIT, and I've been getting more and more heavily involved in anti-war activities for the last few years.
Linguist, socialist anarchist, and one of the most active and famous American intellectuals of the left. Sometimes described as the father of modern linguistics, Chomsky gained public attention in 1967 for his vocal opposition to US intervention in Vietnam and was arrested on multiple occasions for his anti-war activism.
I think that we can see quite clearly some very, very serious defects and flaws in our society, our level of culture, our institutions.
Whilst praised for being prepared to expose what he sees as the high crimes and misdemeanors of America, he is criticized by others for being naive and knee-jerk in his opposition to US foreign policy. In a week where President Obama will announce reforms to the reach and scope of the NSA's surveillance program, it is as yet unclear whether Mr. Obama will truly champion civil liberties rather than cement government surveillance in the name of national security. Noam Chomsky's view is clear. He believes the whistleblower, Edward Snowden, should be honoured, not vilified, for exposing a government treating its citizens as the primary enemy.
Say no more!
And ahead of possible peace talks next week to discuss Syria, was Professor Chomsky right all along to condemn military intervention? Or are the deaths of over 100,000 people and the displacement of millions too high a price to pay for non-interventionism? Well, Noam Chomsky joins us now from Boston, Massachusetts. I should tell you there's a slight problem on the audio to Boston, but Professor Chomsky, let me put it to you that you opposed the attack on Serbia, you opposed the invasion of Iraq, you opposed the invasion of Afghanistan, and you opposed military intervention in Syria. Now America is out of Iraq, it's coming out of Afghanistan, it hasn't gone into Syria. You must suddenly find yourself on the side of the White House.
Well, it's not the first time that such a situation has arisen. So, for example, you could have added a couple of more cases. I was strongly opposed to the Russian invasion of Afghanistan, and when they finally decided to pull out in the mid-'80s, 86, I thought that was a good decision, so I was on the side of the Kremlin. When the South Africa, sure, I think that the criminals should put an end to their criminal activity.
Criminals, but at the same time, the price of doing nothing is very high. 110,000 people dead, maybe more, in Syria, and millions displaced, and we have stood idly by.
If there were some possibility of acting in a way intervening in a way which might alleviate these crimes, then one could justify it. But no such way has been proposed. The only proposals are intervention of a kind that would be very likely to exacerbate the crimes and violence, as is typically the case with foreign intervention.
Should President Assad remain where he is, or is the West right in attempting to negotiate his exit?
I, of course, do not think that Assad and many other leaders around the world should stay where they are. But if you turn to negotiations, the Geneva negotiations that are coming up, and ask, do they offer some hope of alleviating these monstrous crimes? The answer is probably not. The United States has established preconditions which almost guarantee failure. The preconditions that the U.S. insists on, Secretary of State Kerry reiterated them yesterday, are that the Geneva negotiations must lead to a transitional government which excludes the Syrian government, which excludes Assad. It's very hard to see how the government can possibly agree to negotiations in those terms. And incidentally, the United States refuses to allow Iran to be among the dozens of countries that enter into the negotiations because it refuses to accept the American preconditions.
Do you now see that there is a complete change of American policy on Iran, or does this refusal to allow them full participation in the peace talks mean that their attitude to Iran is very limited and limited to the nuclear issue?
No, it means that the United States insists on its right to control and dominate not only the region, but as much of the world as possible. That's what you expect from a superpower with few constraints, either internal or external. It's not pretty, but that's what happens in systems of unconstrained power.
But the physical evidence is that America is retreating, is retrenching, is coming home. And whilst it may still be playing the kind of game you suggest in the Geneva peace talks, America is becoming more isolationist. Is that something that brings you pleasure?
It's not becoming more isolationist. The extreme adventurism of the past decade, which has been extremely harmful to the region. In fact, it's one of the main causes of the turmoil and the conflicts that are now tearing it to shreds. Also been extremely costly and harmful to the United States. The United States is retreating from that extreme adventurism and turning to other forms of terror and violence. So President Obama is at the moment running the largest terrorist campaign in the world by far, the drone campaign. Even the U.S. authorities recognize that almost no one accepts the legality of these murder operations, and that's hardly an example of isolationism, nor is the establishment of special courses.
Very briefly, it's more than 50 years since your activism against the Vietnam War. The world has changed. Have you changed?
Have I changed?
Yes.
Sure. In the early stages of my own opposition to the Vietnam War in the very early 1960s, I misdescribed it. I learned later that I should have changed that. I described it as a civil war in which the United States was illegitimately intervening. As documentary and other evidence has accumulated, it's quite obvious that that was wrong. It was a simple war of aggression, unprovoked aggression, beginning with John F. Kennedy at a level that at that time we didn't know, but now we do know. That's perhaps the major crime of the post-war era, post-Second World War era.
Noam Chomsky, I'm afraid we're out of time, but thank you very, very much indeed for talking to us from Boston.
If you missed any of that, catch up on 4+1 in a moment.